Artificial intelligence. We've been obsessed with it since the early 20th century. Anything we can do to make our lives easier, literally anything, we're happy to surrender and just go with the flow, right? Robots and computers. Hell, even my phone's an Android. Growing up on science fiction with robots doing a lot of the heavy lifting and the dirty work, it's no wonder Americans are so resigned to just let technology take over. After all, who wants to do everything the hard way? Isn't that what technology is for? To make our lives easier? But what happens when the technology evolves faster than the species and society it serves? What happens when we take one giant leap for mankind and fall off the edge of that flat Earth? Right, because with all of the advancements of modern tech, American society is still devolving, backsliding into a time when anti-intellectualism runs rampant, when bullying of the smart people who did the work to know the answers to the questions people are asking is the norm, when Dunning-Kruger is on the ballot. America seems dumber than ever before, despite having the wealth of all the world's answers in the palm of our hands, or our watches, or earbuds, fancy internet glasses, virtual reality spaces. In Overthinking Everything, I've been deconstructing this culture of cultism that we were all raised in, where toxic white Southern culture has permeated society from coast to coast and beyond, enabling some of the worst traits of humanity to be normalized behavior. In our previous 5-part series for entertainment purposes only, and the lead-in, The New World Order of Ethical Ambiguity, I've been exploring the era that led us to the mid-90s and beyond, the time when America surrendered her ethical integrity and sold our souls. In the last episode, 4 Acts Played, I discussed the 4 acts, some legislation, one organization, that impacted our entertainment and information media, tossing them into a blender and pouring out a thick smoothie of infotainment, blurring the lines between fact and fantasy, conjecture and conspiracy, informing and indoctrinating. We report, you decide? That only works if the you deciding is trained in critical thinking to know whether what the we are reporting is complete bupkis or not. In this episode, Commanding Data, we're looking at the growing advancements of technology since the early 20th century, specifically in media and information distribution, and how we, the people, have surrendered our digital fingerprint, our data, our privacy, our rights, and our digital prosperity. Things you probably never even considered because, well, it was stolen right out from under us before we even knew how valuable it all was. Well, someone knew. Well, we didn't sell our souls here. We had our souls stolen and then sold, and we got nothing for it. And you deserve to know why. And welcome to the podcast. Have you actually logged how much time in your life isn't spent in front of a digital screen? Seriously, it's a frightening exercise. Look, right now I'm in front of, well, no fewer than 5 or 6 screens. All of them are recording devices as well. Most have cameras, microphones, apps that I download without fully reading the terms of service. In fact, I kind of just trust that these devices aren't selling me up the river or reporting any of my really bad humor to the FBI. The sad fact is, once you do this little exercise, you're going to be real shocked. Today, what I just said is true for most people. You're surrounded by smart devices. Electronics that are, in many ways, smarter than we are. They think faster, process faster, can translate languages, pull up recipes, instantly play your favorite song, and answer all those nagging questions that, well, before the 90s, we just had to not know, until somehow we found out. Today, with screens everywhere we look, we just have to ask. We don't even have to type. You're thinking, Josh, I drive a lot, so hours of my day are in a car with my phone turned upside down in the seat next to me or in the cup holder. I win. Fair enough. Your phone, like Santa, knows if you've been bad or good. Apps log how much time you spend on your phone while driving and while riding as a passenger. Did you know they can tell the difference? I don't know how, but I just know these things are smart. Scary smart. Now, that car, if it's a later model, has a touchscreen display in the dash or a digital screen display, at least behind the steering wheel. Your microwave, modern refrigerators, printers, we are connected in ways like never before. They're listening, monitoring, and reporting all of that data back to whom exactly? We don't care, do we? I mean, all we know is that our fancy printer automatically orders ink for us when we need it. It's on our doorstep before the old cartridge is dry. We don't care, and we don't. For everything you ever download or electronic device connected to anything, there are pages and pages of legalese no one can understand or read. This is the fine print in the cliche. But it's just not important enough for us to read what all we're surrendering to whomever and for however long. Social media feed algorithms, internet ads, and those coupons we automatically get at checkout just because we connect our shopper card to our debit card and phone number. I mean, let's just ponder the possibilities, right? No, really. Let's. Later in this episode, we'll discuss things like Citizens United, the Patriot Act, and other legislation that took power away from we the people. We'll touch more on the telecommunications acts, but also the things done after those acts to regulate, well, specifically the internet that didn't regulate the internet at all. Last episode, I barely touched on the child protection parts of the legislation and how it gets struck down as unconstitutional. The protecting children part of the internet always seems to trip us up. That seems to be what gets challenged and holds up a lot of the legislation. Yet protecting kids seems like a no-brainer. Why isn't it? This episode is partly about why. I'll discuss in a bit technology's evolution and how robotics will be the future. They'll take our jobs! How what once was pure science fiction is now just science. But just like we discussed in the For Entertainment Purposes Only series about entertainment media evolving faster than we could keep up or cope with, we're focused more now on the internet and our place in it. What is our place? America Online, AOL, had been around since the early 90s as a subscription service. And Hotmail offered free email addresses in 1996. Since then, Americans have slowly been migrating more and more to the digital aspect of information delivery and consumption. As the internet began to take hold in everyone's homes in the early to mid-90s, college dorms also became internet ready. Broke-ass college students who had already bought Metallica's And Justice for All album 3 times already rationalized downloading music for free as being a fan and not artistic thievery. I'm guilty, as charged. I saw it as Columbia House Online without that pesky penny per CD. Honestly, with the way those mail-in clubs gave CDs away, the way radio gave CDs away, the way music was just kind of free anyway, well, lots of people compromised their values for the sake of that song they forgot they even knew but found while downloading hundreds of others. They didn't care if the artist made money. They were rich and successful anyway. At one point, I had tens of thousands of songs, plus a lot of stuff that wasn't music but was labeled as music when it was downloaded. Any song you wanted, if someone else had it, you could have it too. Sounds safe and legal, right? Sharing means caring is what Barney taught us, right? Pearl Jam in the 90s had waged a war against Ticketmaster for their monopoly on concert ticket sales. There was nothing being done to stop the mass purchase of tickets, the scalping, the third-party ticket vendors who would buy up all the tickets and then sell those at a premium. Corporate America was winning. The artists and the fans were losing, and losing big. Well, crooks adapt, and as the late 90s approached, those compilation CDs were all the rage. You no longer had to buy the whole Oingo Boingo CD just to get that one song they had. Then Metallica and a few other artists, big name bands, went to war against Napster and other music downloading services for lost revenues, and to get Congress, to force Congress to act on this growing epidemic of artistic exploitation. After all, this was now a decade removed from music having to have warning labels on it, and now kids can just download whatever they want from Napster. They better hope it's heavy metal or rap. We see a similar trend with content creators today fighting against artistic exploitation on the platforms in which we're hosted. Of course, it's all our fault for signing away our rights with those pesky terms of service no one has time to read. When my daughter was younger, she loved going to those trampoline parks. You know, those huge warehouses full of wall-to-wall bouncerific jumpification. Well, it's always fun to make the kids happy and take some friends and let themselves get worn out before a sleepover so the parents can actually sleep. Well, the thing about those places is, when you go, you have to register every kid, even if it isn't your kid, or their parent has to register online. And you have to sign this waiver that says, if this kid falls and snaps their neck, you can't sue the place. You, the parent, assume all responsibility by taking them to this dangerous place, even though they opened a clearly dangerous business that clearly appeals to children just to profit off of pester power, developing brains hungry for adventure but too immature to process consequence. Everyone's thrill of the risk of it, I guess, you know? Well, like those big dump trucks that have that little sign on the back that says, "Not responsible for falling debris." Oh, so that sign just takes care of the big dent on my door when the mound of dirt and rock fell out of the back of your truck. Why would that be a risk an open dump truck would take by filling that dump truck and driving down an interstate? Seems odd, don't you think? Now, wouldn't you just assume that the jumpy place had at least some liability? Nope, not when you admit going in that they don't, for anything at all that happens there. You sign it away just to shut the kids up and let them go have fun for a little while, just like we do every time we have to bypass those terms of service on any and everything we can. We just want the app. We don't care that it has access to... Well, what does it have access to? Do you know? Do you even know how to change that in your phone settings? Most Americans, even the ones who don't trust anyone, it seems, are gullible, vulnerable, and naive. In previous episodes, I've discussed that slippery slope of opinion and how we often can't pass our own purity tests we apply to others when judging or condemning them. So, let's take a look at the "I don't trust anybody" paranoia specifically regarding alt-right extremism in America. From "Don't Tread on Me" to the militarized extremists training to overthrow America from within, there's an insidious cancer brewing among the less educated and more rural faction of American society. These aren't derogatory swipes at my own culture or even my perspective. In fact, many highly educated conservatives fall to extremist ideals. However, the actual extremism is often carried out by those with limited academic scope or experience. When I speak of toxic white Southern culture, I could just as easily discuss rural, but that is discriminatory since this ideology is present in inner cities and non-rural settings. In fact, when crafting my thesis, if you will, I was careful in my wording. I do carry a great deal of cultural and experiential bias, so I must be aware of that, and everything I consider must filter through that a few times to ensure I'm being pragmatic. When I started writing and researching for this series several years ago, what I started with was bias. The culture in which I grew up was toxic. It was white. It was Southern. But there are so many things about Southern culture that aren't altogether toxic. Granted, a little digging, and most of them pretty much kind of are, but I didn't want to out and out condemn Southern culture as the source of the problem. I wasn't sure I could sustain that through academic scrutiny if any of this ever got that far. So I dug deeper within myself, within my culture, within our culture. The fascinating revelation I noticed in my historical analysis was that much of these traits of paranoia, superstition, and winning at all costs, among others, can be traced through almost a migration pattern of oppression trauma from either religious or governmental abusers from Northern Europe straight through Appalachia. Tracing back even my own bloodline's immigration to America is so similar for many Southerners today. Port of entry, East Coast, through the higher elevations, because that's Northern Europe's familiar terrain. Virginia's, Carolinas, Kentucky, and Tennessee, Georgia. What was different about those settlers than others? I'll discuss that and answer that later this season, as well as how this culture spread like wildfire through rural America and how it's been cultivated since. Well, how it's been cultivated I just answered for entertainment purposes only. Reagan put a price tag on the head of every child in America in 1981 when he appointed Mark S. Fowler as the new head of the Federal Communications Commission. What Fowler did was deregulate a lot of the restrictions on media and open broadcast to the free market. And this is a big dividing factor between right and left fiscal ideology, the power of the free market. Fowler insisted that the government had no place standing in the way of the prosperity of Americans. He felt like the government's strict regulations on what could be marketed to whom, at what times, interfered with Americans' right to financially prosper and, I suppose, by an extension, that Americans should have a right to choose what they consume, rather than having the government interfere and put restrictions on what one could consume, when and how old one had to be when one did consume. TLDR this for you. Reagan had rich friends to make richer, and if the 60s and 70s showed Washington anything, it's that they could not control America's woke-ass young generation. So there was a deliberate effort to dumb us down and numb us down, to make us worker drones for this grand trickle-down pyramid scheme that we all bought into. Reagan should be dug up and tried, just like Bernie Madoff, for how he and his cronies made off with the American dream. And we can talk about home ownership, the debt cycle, medical debt, student debt, jobs, college careers, trades, and just how hard it is to make it today versus generations prior. All of that is valid. It's all on the table. But the student debt aspect ties right in. The demonization of education has been a thing since kids began revolting against the traditions and the ideas of back home. When America shifted into full-throttle colonialism and war games interference in the 1960s, it was fatigue for many who wanted to live in a world where every day and every headline wasn't about war, hostilities, and civil regimes that would be the next Hitler if America didn't intervene. The indoctrination didn't take for many, and for many more, it would wear off over the years. Anti-war protests weren't new to this country by the 1960s, but it certainly became more prominent thanks to the media's growing influence. The 1970s were a critical turning point in a lot of ways. In fact, had the economy not been completely in the shitter for most of it, we might have seen a lot of social shifts that would have taken America into the new age better prepared. However, we had Nixon, Ford, Carter, and then Reagan. Both parties' conventions were contentious, to say the least. Both parties couldn't get their shit together, and we the people suffered. The whole decade. But then, the anti-war sentiment narrative was flipped to anti-American, which really only made America herself seem to be a war hawk nation. Images of protesters and Americans spitting on Vietnam soldiers coming home, and the harsh realities of a nation who learned, read, and wasn't just taking the spoonful of super patriotism Uncle Sam was feeding them. Under God and the pledge didn't work. Branding anyone not American as unchristian didn't work. All of the things conservatives learned from Hitler and Mussolini, Stalin, and, well, most of Asia didn't work. All of the indoctrination strategies might work on a people under the slightly more oppressive thumb of a more tyrannical government, by at least American standards. That was the X factor. Pay close attention. This wasn't on accident. If you think people in power aren't fascinated with Adolf Hitler, you're naive. I'd argue many powerful people have read Mein Kampf. That isn't to say they're a Nazi or a sympathizer. It's to say that Hitler had to be one of the most brilliant men to have ever lived, right? I mean, what else could explain how he managed to do what he did to Europe in a relatively short period of time? It wasn't all him, but he certainly gets much of the credit. How could one argue that Hitler was a buffoon? To suggest that would be to suggest what about those who fell for his buffoonery? No. The man knew what he was doing, and everyone needs to understand that. Just like those in power in our own country. There was a playbook to follow. It was just selling your soul to the darkest side in order to follow it. Not Mein Kampf, mind you, the actual book. But watching what people do, how they do what they do, and seeking to really understand why, well, that's deconstructing. To control the masses, you must find a way to reach the masses, win them over, bend them to your will, then call them to action. I'm sure there are more accurate or academic explanations of the stages of mass manipulation for building a cult following, but these are relevant to this episode's topic of our place in the digital space. To control the masses, you must find a way to reach the masses. Media, then the internet. Winning them over isn't hard. Just speak to the wants and needs of your audience. You don't have to do anything. Just say the right things the right way. Then once you make them like you, or at least respect you enough to know you're going to do what they want, they will bend to your will. Then all you need is a mission and to ask them to do the thing. Many will chase after that like a dog after a rabbit. Hitler did this the old-fashioned way. His cross-the-pond opposition did it a different way. FDR sold policy, pointed out the failures of his predecessors, and then, when Roosevelt won, he won in landslide fashion. He kicked the door down and issued executive order after executive order, effectively creating the New Deal for America, in a my way or the highway approach of governing that slapped the obstruction in the face and got stuff done. Lots of stuff. Including the founding of the Federal Communications Commission, which had been the Federal Radio Commission in years prior. That same FCC that would later rewrite society's mental and emotional DNA, create the mental health, obesity, and various other issues in children today, and bring us Howard Stern, Rush Limbaugh, and Donald Trump. You see, what this suspicious Southern migration culture wasn't smart enough to realize was that everything their kinfolk had fled from was happening to them right in front of their faces, and they were voting for the ones doing it to them. Again, I have a whole series coming up on answering how the hell that happens, but just know that culturally it did, and many in rural communities swallowed that hook, line, and sinker. The religious oppressors had convinced them that if they didn't fight for the religious oppression of others, their deity would judge them, and theirs was the kingdom of heaven as the chosen ones, blessed and redeemed, washed in the blood of the Lamb, forgiven by whomever for whatever they do. And if you didn't side with them, you didn't side with God. And if you didn't side with God, you weren't Christian. And if you weren't Christian, you weren't American. And if you weren't American, you were a commie. And if you were a commie, well, this sort of message hammered into people's heads over and over and over for years, and then the religious and political establishment that brainwashing is built on collapses and can't sustain its own purity test. Well, those wires get crossed, like I've said. When the foundations of our values become fluid, everything becomes fluid, remember? So in 1981, Mark S. Fowler, on orders from Ronald Reagan for the sole purpose of profit by exploitation, masked as individual liberty and free market capitalism, made it so that commercials could air in children's programming. Product placement restrictions were lifted, messaging restrictions were lifted, what had to air when and how much of it was changed. So many of the regulations the Action for Children's Television, fought for to protect young, developing brains in this too much too soon society were scrapped. No longer could parents turn on a children's program and count on the child having an innocent learning experience. Now, after these messages, we'll be right back. We've got a toy commercial, a promo for a new show, craft dinner, cereal, snack cakes, and more. Toys, chips, theme parks, whatever. And as we discussed previously, pester power is real. By the time Reagan and Fowler put a price tag on every kid in America, Washington had known about pester power for decades, whether they had a name for it yet or not. Those kids were going to pester mom and dad to buy all of that stuff. Then they were going to eat all of that stuff and drink all of that soda, consume all of that commercialism, capitalism, materialism, and narcissism. Look, not to be all conspiracy theory rabbit hole here, because it isn't. Processed junk food has made kids physically and mentally unhealthier. Learning challenges, brain and body development, personality issues, depression, the list goes on and on. One day, I know we will see actual studies linking these challenges to things like diet, and whatever we are consuming is toxic. We are the sum of all our parts. Unhealthy exposure to images and ideas before the brain is ready has traumatized generations of children, and the constant influx of confusing entertainment media has warped generations of children, forcing a sort of evolution, or devolution, as it were, we didn't ask for, and we weren't ready for. We need to understand that the data was in front of them, that children should not be exposed to marketing and messaging certain ways, and the Republican Party knew that data and still did what they did to dumb us down and numb us down. Why? Again, we know history repeats, or at least rhymes. They know too. They wouldn't have another war with protests the way the Korean and Vietnam eras saw. No. By the time the Republicans attacked the Middle East a decade later, Americans would know their place much better. This was the strategy of controlling the masses. A robot is defined in practical applications as a machine capable of carrying out a complex series of actions automatically, especially a machine programmed by a computer. An android, the phones notwithstanding, is the basic same thing as a robot, but with a humanoid appearance. These are all too real by today's standards, and have been for much of the last few decades. We've had robots, one could argue, since the assembly line was invented. But in the form we are most familiar with for at least nearly 3/4 of a century. We start veering into fantasy when we talk about cyborgs, though, right? A cyborg is a hypothetical combination between robotics and organics. It's most popularly visualized with the DC superhero character Vic Stone, whose father's lab accident blew half his body to pieces, and a desperate dad plugged in alien tech to his boy to save his life. Thus, Vic Stone became Cyborg. Science fiction, huh? And not so fast. With advancements in tech, we're already seeing the reality of Luke getting his hand lopped off by his daddy and having it replaced with a human-looking robot hand. Modern advancements are showing great strides in robotic prosthetics, and these will be the future of medicine, whether we like it or not. Robots, androids, and cyborgs, well, sometimes they keep the secrets of the galaxy, like R2-D2. Or get in the way like his brass buddy. Sometimes they warn us of danger, danger. Sometimes they ask if we want to play a game. or simply wish us, "Good morning, Dave." They're iron giants, little futuristic treaded trash compactors, bicentennial babysitters, cyborg cops, overblown airbags, giant robot alien creatures that turn into cars, or cars that turn into robots, or they're simply here from the future to kill every single person named Sarah Connor. Well, from Metropolis to Westworld, and everything in between, for nearly a century, our society has been fascinated with robots, until we actually use them. When it comes to tech, we have to ask, are you a good witch or a bad witch? Well, the issue with these examples I gave are simple. You can't trust that question because all of those are more than robots. They're AI, artificial intelligence. Remember last episode when I was talking about how our brains think like computers because people who thought made computers to think the way humans know how to think? Well, this advancement in technology takes robots, androids, and cyborgs to the next level. AI is very smart. It's like a very smart robot, capable of thinking and executing tasks like a human would. Complex tasks. AI can learn. Robots can too, if they're programmed with new information or commands. A robot, remember, is defined as a machine capable of carrying out a complex series of actions automatically, especially a machine programmed by a computer. AI removes that last statement. Facial recognition, voice synthesis, that's all AI, deepfakes too. When you say out loud to someone in person that you're going to have to buy a new cooler for the warmer weather, and then you start getting the ads for coolers popping up everywhere you look, that's AI. AI is everywhere, learning about us, learning our habits, our routes to work, which stores we shop at, what we buy when we're there, how often we buy the things. I have a lot to talk about in this episode, so let's just assume you're not going to Google what all in our daily lives is artificial intelligence and just take my word for it that it is all around us. Artificial intelligence is invading almost every industry. There are web services that offer AI writing. I am a writer! That tech replaces me. Well, it can't. There's a long way to go before AI can mimic the individual styles in a cost-effective manner, right? Predictive text. AI art. Look, we've all seen the big trend of typing something into the search engine and letting the AI make digital art based on your description. How long before we decide we don't really need artists? AI is in your face every day. AI is in the algorithm. It's constantly learning and evolving to give you a better user experience. Just like the coupons that are customized for us, we kind of forget they're customized because we've let the store have permission to go through our shopping lists and habits and market those things directly to us for 30 cents off grapes. On social media apps, there are filters that trend where people have a cartoon or digital avatar made of their face. They do this video matching their facial expressions and matching the mouth movements without realizing that they might be surrendering their digital persona, handing over a digital prototype of you in the digital world to that particular app. It was right there in the terms of service. Didn't you read it? That maybe they could one day take a digital version of you and use AI to have an animated Josh Brandon who speaks like Josh Brandon because it's written like Josh Brandon. But Josh Brandon isn't from Josh Brandon. Oh no, this Josh Brandon is a what? Look, I know this is a far reach, but trust me, it isn't. Social media apps that encourage us to contribute and create content are asking us to do this for free while we don't get paid a dime for it. If we do, it's micro pennies on the dime, and the talent in the entertainment equation is again getting shafted. Historically, this is always the case. We let that happen because The Rock signs onto a movie for like $200 million, and we think someone earns that kind of money because we're told we might one day earn that kind of money. So if you oppose that now, you'll be a hypocrite later when you cash that check. So just don't be a hypocrite and be gluttonous over money. We failed that choose your own adventure. In the digital world, we have a place and we have value, but you wouldn't know it, would you? It's because our value, the value of we the people, has never been appreciated by Washington, America, the consumer audience, or otherwise. In fact, as I've argued before, the American working class is the exploited, oppressed group in America. Not to lighten the plight of marginalized communities, but the real assault is class more than any other category. All of the other bigotry, biases, and persecution is on the table, of course, but it's an assault on the working class. This country was founded for rich white bigots to be richer, whiter, and bigotier. That assault has just happened as I've laid out. We've been dumbed down. Information is so abundant and readily available, but there's little regulation on maintaining its integrity. We almost default to not looking something up because it's so commonly out there and easy to find. We also have conditioned society to ridicule those who spend their time learning how to think critically, to deconstruct an article, research the facts, and come to a pragmatic conclusion. Then, through this systematic and decades-long dehumanization of others, by the time those FCC regulations were lifted, Americans were barely beyond toddler stage before Mama and Daddy filled the cabinets with all the sugary, sweet, and salty yum-yums and said, "Carpe diem, kiddos!" Now let's take a few more perspectives on artificial intelligence before we go all legislation talk. Just as with art and writing, AI is making its way to the music realm as well. AI programs designed to not plagiarize other existing music while creating something original set within these parameters may soon replace much of the copyright and background music that free music people use in the music space. Composers and musicians, just like writers and artists, voice actors, singers, it's all on the chopping block moving forward. All of the things that basically created everything we know and love about culture and pop culture and being entertained will eventually be replaced to some degree with tech, if not altogether with artificial intelligence. AI can create, but what's missing is the authenticity behind that art. Art isn't just aesthetically pleasing. The art that stood the test of time in all mediums have heart, a story, something that makes it special. The human element. What happens when AI just creates without that story or heart? What happens when AI succeeds at duplicating that story or heart? That seems for humanity a lose-lose proposition for the arts, the artists, and continuing our respective cultures as we progress. While we accept that sports brings opportunity to those exceptionally talented, we've also seen catastrophic injuries and worse through athletics. Whether it's a football player getting hit so hard his heart stops, or the traumatic brain injuries that same sport is responsible for, whether it's the championship belt-holding wrestler missing a move and breaking his ankle for real, and the ref then giving the signal that the show is over, kayfabe is as shattered as the ankle bone, and everybody just looks at their phone until the soap opera storyline part starts again. Whether it's Shawn Michaels' lazy eye that many argued was from taking a corner shot to the eye socket on one of those steel stairs leading to the ring during a match, whether it's Chris Benoit or any number of professional football players accused of equally heinous acts with brain trauma at least partially linked, boxers, fighters, race car drivers, Herschel Walker, whatever it may be. So let's overthink that, for entertainment purposes only. The rigors and risks of contact sports specifically are great. There are the injuries you see and the ones you don't. All of them are trauma. Traumas sustained over a game. That should be fun, but money makes it big fun. Once integration into professional athletics began, the rise of capitalism and mass marketing also coincides. There was professional athletics before, there was money and marketing involved. But when the white folks saw how good the black folk were and how fun they were to watch, well, then you look at college and when it started costing your future to attend. You think this isn't about race and white supremacy until you realize it is about race and white supremacy. Impoverished, marginalized communities with exceptional workhorse children whose hopes and dreams of getting out of that life was college. And their hopes of college, because college was expensive now, was working hard and getting on the team so you had a scholarship. But Josh, you're being racist. Lots of poor white kids from just as oppressed and impoverished rural communities, they experience the same journeys. And Josh, you're showing your bias and racism because look at the Mannings. Sometimes your entire journey is of privilege and you never have to struggle for anything because that road was paid for you a long time ago. And that's a whole lot of what makes up college and professional sports. So see, Josh, it's not all about race. So this classism that is at the foundation of the divide in America between the elite and the working class, because the racial issues have never truly been resolved the way a civilized society would, because those same rich white elite know that when we, the people, figure out that it is about race and it's still about race because they don't want us to realize it's about us, and once we, the people, start realizing that we've all been used and exploited, that the athlete has been used and exploited by the schools, institutions, organizations, and society who just loved them while they could run, but forgot them when they could barely walk. Kind of like our veterans. But stand for that stupid song, won't you? But the fan has been used and exploited as well by everyone involved. We've been sucked into the cultism of demonizing the other team, their fans, their players' wives, children, friends, whatever. We laugh it off because it's the stereotype shtick we see on TV or movies, that rabid, obnoxious fan, without realizing we are just as rabid and just as obnoxious. Self-awareness goes a long way. We are conditioned, groomed, indoctrinated, and trained to desensitize ourselves so we can feel good rooting for our team. Like a drug. It's just the chemicals in our brains we're addicted to. Those poor kids get to go to college for free on a scholarship. A few kids grow up with the talent to get rich playing the game, while most of the kids walk away with complications from injuries sustained while playing the game. The game. Things changed in the 1980s with video game consoles. Today, those are chock full of predictive AI technology in your Xbox, PC, PlayStation, Nintendo, VR spaces. Sports video games, specifically, are so realistic today that you could just set a game on autoplay and watch the computer play against itself. To you, the viewer, what would be the difference between that experience and if they were humans on a real field playing with real balls you were watching on TV? Forget for a moment about the live experience because that would change, but think of that like a huge glorified exclusive interactive sports bar in the future. Sitting at home, you just watch your team win or lose because it's still managed the same way by executives and boards drafting the new AI-generated class, which could be based on real athletes who excel in areas that aren't dangerous contact sports. Part of evolution, after all, is learning not to slam your forehead into a tree to get the fruit to fall out from it, right? We find safer ways of accomplishing the same goals. Imagine a world where education isn't held hostage for money, and a kid didn't have to put their body on the line just to have a better shot of making better money maybe one day down the road. Imagine if we still have sports, but it's AI and humans are kept safe, unharmed, uninjured, and we still are entertained, and have some subscription to the competition and sports cultism we seem to require. Of course, AI would have to evolve and adapt because whether it's golf, hockey, fighting, racing, basketball, baseball, football, or any other sport, we're into it for the emotional investment, that soap opera storyline, whatever the sport. It ain't just pro wrestling. We're in it for the struggle and the success, the highs and lows. Can AI learn and deliver that? Would we, the people, embrace it, even if it meant no more professional athletes to look up to? Just a bunch of random avatars to root for. How real can virtual reality get? Lastly, for all we think one way or the other about artificial intelligence, what happens when AI meets our most sacred establishments? Our mores are generally centered around a culture's primary religious leanings. Those cultural norms are based off of that. But when AI intersects with religion, I could do a whole episode about this. But I'm just going to leave you with, imagine looking at the AI digital art examples from before, and consider religion warped through that funhouse mirror over the course of one single generation. Give it what we've seen televangelism has done to religion since just the late 1970s. Danger, Will Robinson. Danger. The fact is, by the time the internet invaded our homes and consumed our collective consciousness, the younger generation, more apt to catch on with rapidly evolving technology. Okay, those kids who would be setting up Mama's AOL on her new e-machine would be so dumbed down with mass marketing and commercialism that they wouldn't ask, "What's in it for me?" And years of demonizing the arts for being the arts, or compromising the arts with capitalism and corruption, it desensitized us, numbed us down to the point that no one really cares that I spend so much of my time on this show from which I make no income. In fact, we don't care at all that most of the content we consume on social media today has been created with no compensation to the creator whatsoever. And we just consume it until we're bloated and sick without ever realizing everyone involved, just like my professional sports example before, is being manipulated and exploited and being sold a bill of goods that, well, at least people who didn't have a voice before finally have a voice. Sounds like those marginalized communities finally having a hope of an education and a future if they just run fast and do what Coach tells them, right? Who is asking, why didn't we always have a voice? And why aren't we getting paid for our voice now? Years ago, the gatekeepers were your station managers of radio station and television stations, the program directors, the casting agents, and other people who had their foot against the door of the success suite. If you had what it takes, and that was subjective. If you had the look, of course, and that came with its own corruption. There were all these, if you're good enough, conditions that it came with. It truly became about selling your soul at times. Today, that dynamic has changed, which we'll talk about more in our next episode, The Age of Anti-Social Media. Today, it isn't just the creators' collective rights as a society. We're churning out multiple pieces of content or videos a day with nothing to show for it but invisible followers that, might watch us again, might buy a t-shirt from our merch store, might buy our book if we ever finish it, if they're even that aware that we are anything other than this guy you're watching right now in this moment. Well, there's nothing in place to ensure that I get my piece of the pie for my hard-earned work, because of course there's no union for this sort of thing. No one to fight for or protect our rights and lobby against big social media and online corporations, global multinational corporations that make a lot of money and wouldn't if they had to pay their employees a livable wage. Employees. Well, that only applies if you're getting paid for the work you do. What is it we call people who don't get paid but are expected to work for free with unfulfilled promises if they do? I know it's a different term if one is only temporarily bound to that particular entity because that entity is the sole provider of said opportunity. Don't tell me it's a stretch. Engage in a candid conversation about consumption of social media entertainment with somebody. People refer to it as free TV. They know they're being entertained. They sometimes think they're watching people who make money doing it. Most of the time, they don't really care if the person is or is not, because they aren't special enough to create anything. So they have to work, and this person can create videos and have fun with their little hobby, but I work for a living and so should they. Even though one person is working to create the content and another is just sitting around watching. No offense. This is how we're trained to see people in our economy. See others, because just like Ted DiBiase, the WWE's $1 Million Man, he would teach us that everybody's got a price. Everybody's got to pay. And the $1 Million Man always gets his way. Seems like Vince McMahon knew something we didn't all along. Seems like that warning label was right in front of us the whole time, right? Well, when it came to the internet, big tech, data privacy, and our rights and respective value in that very wealthy marketplace, everybody had a price. Everybody was going to pay. The million and billion-dollar men always got their way. And what of we, the people? Well, there's the 1914 Federal Trade Commission Act, which set forth parameters on unfair or deceptive practices in the commercial space, things like bait and switch, lemon laws. You couldn't say a product was healthy if you knew it wasn't. I mean, okay, so that happened for a long time after, but again, that's capitalism and commercialism. Everybody has a price. The first thing to note is that from there's no laws. There's just not much in place to protect we the people. I mean, in all these years, Washington has failed America in providing a single piece of legislation that would protect children, everyone, and make the internet a safe place for all. There is no single piece of legislation on the books. Rather, this mishmash of state and federal level, hundreds of laws, regulations, restrictions, and a loose toy box of often counterproductive and contradictory ideas and guidelines that lead us in circles. The second thing to note is that in my research for this legislation, I was momentarily confused. I saw that when I searched terms like internet data privacy rights, I began reading about these extensive regulations set forth by the government, which would ensure the responsibility on the part of the broadcaster or entertainment or commercial corporate entity, that the people wouldn't suffer the woes of capitalistic greed, but rather a responsible filter to assess the greater good. Then I realized that some of the words were spelled with U's, like endeavor. And I realized that I was reading articles from the UK and Europe, where they take this sort of thing much seriously. In fact, the UK put forth their Data Protection Act in 1998. Again, I say there is no single piece of American legislation to protect our rights on social media, cell phones, thermostats, power strips, kitchen appliances, watches, anything. The biggest difference for us is most of Europe and the UK's regulations center around the notion that if you give this app you're on now the right to use your information, if they farm that out to anyone else, they have to let you know. In America? In America, we sign up for an app and they can sell our data that we allow them to collect, and then they can sell that data to someone else, and we never find out unless something happens where it crosses our radar. Imagine what that would be. Now, realize how many of us never experience something like that, so we never consider just how much we've been sold out. Our data, the information we produce, is worth big money to big business, big tech, big everything. But we, the people, don't see a dime. It's like we are farming data. In America, there are laws and regulations that focus on specific groups of people and specific types of data, but no blanket protection that we, the people, own our data outright. What is your data? Your guess is as good as mine. It's any and everything you say, do, every permission you grant them without reading the terms of service. We had legislation passed for our healthcare data, HIPAA. We had laws protecting our credit information, educational privacy. For many years, we even had government restrictions on wiretapping phones and devices. But that last one, now that was before the internet, so it doesn't cover a lot of what permeates our daily lives, and the Patriot Act changed the game, which we'll get to soon enough. Then there's the Video Privacy Protection Act, which is solely due to the fact that a journalist dug deep on a Supreme Court nominee and pulled their VHS rental history. No one wanted that to just be a thing someone could find, so that law was pushed through. That law, written for VHS tapes, does nothing for protecting the histories of what you stream, search, or otherwise. There's been nothing put into place to update this since VHS tapes were a thing. In fact, no law, regulation, or legislation whatsoever is on the books in America to grant we, the people, the rights to our own likeness on the internet. We have no protections on ourselves, our data, the information we collect and generate for these wealthy companies that then sell and profit off of our data over and over and over again. And yet many decry the calls for redistribution of wealth because it seems many don't seem to recognize their own worth and value in our system. The internet has made that value skyrocket. We just don't realize it. But do commodities like gold, oil, pork belly, and Bitcoin realize their value goes up and down? Of course not. Commodities aren't people. But people are commodities. In 1981, Ronald Reagan and Mark S. Fowler, his FCC chief, made sure every child was a commodity. Well, since then, Washington has struggled to protect the most vulnerable and influenceable of our society: children. Today, as the younger generation crumbles under a realization of lost hopes and dreams, the insurmountable task of making it in a world where everything's against them, and the mental health struggles that just come with being a child, there still aren't strong laws to regulate and protect children in the tech space, where they're most vulnerable to exposure to harmful things and bullying. COPA, the Children's Online Privacy and Protection Act, went into effect in 2000 but did little to protect much of anything except information. Its lame predecessor, COPA, just 1P, the Children's Online Protection Act, lay dormant for nearly 2 years until the privacy part was added. The distinction isn't as important as the bumbling and fumbling Washington has done since the dawn of the internet to give the appearance that they're trying to protect children while doing absolutely nothing to protect children. It's almost like they don't want to protect children from the bad things, but want to convince everyone else the bad things are something else entirely. So, you know how a lot of sites and social media won't allow kids under 13 on them. And we think it's because those sites and apps realize how vulnerable kids are and how their service could and would be misused to target young children. Well, not entirely. It's because the cost and hassle of complying with the laws and regulations about what can and can't be done with the data and privacy of children under 13 is so expensive and expansive, it's just not financially worthwhile for anyone to allow children under 13 on their service to begin with, even though they do all the time and just leave it up to the account holder to tell the truth with little to no concern for verification if it's a real person. COPA, 2Ps, is important in that it does regulate children's data and privacy rights and does control what can be marketed to those accounts. But who tells the truth about their age anyway, right? In 2000, SEPA was signed into law by Bill Clinton. The Children's Internet Protection Act was one of the last things he did before W was inaugurated and the world went to shit. Previously, I've talked about the Communications Decency Act and the COPA, 1P. that both got struck down as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court based mostly on First Amendment rights. However, what this law came down to was regulating federal funding and the conditions under which that funding was used. If someone used the funding like a school or a library, then that institution had to put technology protection measures in place to prevent kids from seeing obscene material, pornography, or material that would be harmful to minors. I mean, of course, the legislation wouldn't provide any funding for those technology protection measures, but fine print. Obscenity had been legally defined by Miller v. California in 1973. There's also clear legal language on underage, inappropriate material. The particular actual phrase I don't want showing up in a script or algorithm. Harmful to minors. Well, that's basically language that describes content that's just toxic for toxic's sake, and the kind of toxic a child isn't developed enough to differentiate or fully understand. Things like sexual material, violent. Oh, wait. It had nothing to do with violence, aggression, bullying, hateful or harmful behavior, bigotry, or anything like that. It was all about sex. Specifically and explicitly about sex. As if sex was the only harmful thing kids might experience online. But this law did nothing for the home internet user. It simply said you couldn't look up porn on a school or library computer, and if they let you, they could lose federal funding. It really seems like Ronald Reagan, Mark S. Fowler, the Republican Party, and capitalism has done more grooming to children than even the church. I wonder why all the fuss about drag queens. The Patriot Act was racist, reactionary legislation pushed through by President George W. Bush 6 weeks following the attacks on the World Trade Center of 9/11. America was reeling in fear of the enemy within, and we would do anything to ensure our safety, just to feel safe. So to hell with civil rights and the Constitution, we said, and we allowed the government to drastically alter the data collection, privacy, and rights of Americans. It didn't matter back then because we weren't the terrorists. And they were only going to use this against brown people with funny names and turbans. Remember? What it did significantly was loosen a lot of the surveillance and spy game shit the government used to not be able to just do. But thanks to a terrorist attack, Republicans now had everything they needed to convince we the people to surrender those rights and protections, so they didn't have to worry so much about that pesky Constitution in their investigations. Guantanamo, waterboarding, and American patriot heroes pissing on prisoners? Patriot Act. We were too dumbed down to know better and too numbed down to see Middle Easterners as anything but, well, as I said, most Americans couldn't even tell a Middle Easterner from someone from another country or region altogether. Then in 2010, America, dumber and number than ever before, allowed the Supreme Court to hear a case that would overturn previous key cases that had restricted and regulated the influence of corporate money in our election process. Before 2010, huge corporations had specific guidelines regarding how much and how often they could contribute to a political campaign or process. What groups and organizations could and could not, and how much. Look, this law was more complex than even the average non-lawyer can fathom. There is a lot to it. But to know that in 2010, we the people were legally considered as equal as Amazon, that we both had equal rights as far as contributing to campaigns, to contributing to the election process. The issue, of course, is that Amazon is worth more than we the people collectively. America has been sold out. Americans never stood a chance. We're the livestock. We're the worker drones. There's a reason every time we ask for our earned piece of that pie that's being stolen from us by big tech, big business, big everything. And Washington, too, we're stomped down and called socialists. History does repeat. At very least, it rhymes. Coming up, we're continuing to deconstruct the digital era with more talk about our rights and where we belong in the digital world. Our next episode will break down how we are already living our lives in a virtual realm. Not of red pill or blue pill like the Matrix, but a living, breathing, organic, and virtual hybrid world, torn between our social media personas and our real selves. That's right. In the age of anti-social media, I'm deconstructing how our society took traumatized mental cases and let them have kids with zero training, then made those parents work 2 jobs while giving those parents no better option than to plant their kids in front of a deregulated broadcast media like a Clockwork Orange, creating even more traumatized mental cases who then had kids themselves and slapped those kids on the internet at 9 years old, and surprise! What comes out of that easy bake oven is one of those shit pies from the Help. I'm breaking down where it all went wrong and how we've been sold up the river on internet rights and safety, all for the sake of what? Freedom? It sure ain't riches, that's for sure. But I'm analyzing it all to see where we the people have been used, abused, exploited, and manipulated over and over again. And we keep letting it happen. As I'm deconstructing a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining me. Check out some of my other videos on YouTube. I've taken the time to put all of my videos in playlists for you. My TikToks, Overthinking Everything, my original music, clips of my acting and voiceover career. It's all organized in playlists for your convenience. Check out my merch store and get your Sir Talks a Lot, Swags a Lot. Follow me on TikTok, like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Just do all the things I need you to do to help this series grow. And if you like this series, please consider a donation to Cash App, or you can subscribe on Patreon. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.